All right, everyone. Welcome to Revolution 213. I'd like to read as our epigraph for today's public seminar a passage from Adom Getachew's brilliant book, World Making After Empire. It's on page 17. Getachew writes, "For Kwame Nkrumah, decolonization was not a wind blowing over the African continent, but instead a, quote, hurricane of change that is razing to the ground the many bastions of colonialism." And then she continues in her words, "Decolonization, understood as a revolutionary project, thus required remaking the international order that sustained relations of dependence and domination. Nation building was to be situated and realized through world making." As Adom Getachew forcefully demonstrates in her work, the revolutionary movements for independence in Africa at mid-20th century were truly a high point for critique and praxis, for a form of critical theory and action that was praxis-oriented and praxis-driven. The anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle on the ground was spearheaded in large part by what Biodun Jeifo called last session worldly philosophers, revolutionary thinkers thinking and acting in consort, actively in conversation and debate and disagreement with each other and other revolutionary actors around the globe, confronting theories of Marxism and communism, of African socialism, even of Stalinism, and studying closely the many experiments in liberation that were taking place around the world, or had taken place around the world, such as, of course, the Haitian Revolution during the 18th century, studied famously in C.L.R. James's seminal book, The Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture, and the San Domingo Revolution. Now, last session, we discussed with Biodun Jeifo the critical writings and the historical trajectory of the ideas and work of Frantz Fanon especially, but also Aimé Césaire, Léopold Senghor, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, among others, at the Paris, Rome, and Bandung conferences. We were focusing on the collective work of the many worldly philosophers who assembled for the international conferences of Black writers and artists, all of whom were deeply involved in these critical exchanges and efforts at world making that we'll be discussing today. In this session, with Adom Getachew, we turn to the critical writings and praxis of Kwame Nkrumah, C.L.R. James, and George Padmore, among others. And it's hard to imagine a more critical, praxis-oriented group of thinkers and actors. It's hard to imagine a more perfect critical theorist to explore their work. It's a great pleasure and an honor to welcome Adom Getachew this evening, one of the foremost contemporary critical thinkers on the anti-colonial movements of mid-20th century and of the work of Nkrumah, Padmore, James, among others. Adom Getachew is the author of the book I was reading from, which serves as our epigraph, World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination. And there she argues that Black Anglophone anti-colonial critics and nationalists, that the project was to transform the world, not just create independent nations, and certainly not merely diagnose the crises of colonialism or the crises of imperialism, but rather to create a new international order and to serve as a beacon for world transformation. In her words, again, from the text, decolonization, she writes, decolonization was a project of reordering the world that sought to create a domination-free and egalitarian international order. And against the standard view of decolonization as a moment of nation building, she recasts anti-colonial nationalism as world making. Adom Getachew has also written 2 recent articles that we will be discussing during the course of this seminar because they intersect so directly with core questions of Revolution 1313. The first was just published in Dissent magazine and is entitled The New Black Internationalism. And there she demonstrates how the movement for Black lives and other current movements around the world actually can be interpreted as partaking in an earlier internationalist language and vision. She suggests how this might recast America's place in the world. I think that piece is particularly important for us because it really ties into and elaborates the conclusions of her book, which, as you recall, at the end of her book, on page 181, she concludes by, on the one hand, recognizing the eclipse of self-determination as world-making, but nevertheless sees continuity today in movements for Black lives and other contemporary movements for racial justice. So the final sentences of the book are the following. In the Black Atlantic world from which the world makers of this book emerged, intimations of a new language are afoot in the movement for Black lives, the Caribbean demand for reparations for slavery and genocide, and South African calls for a social and economic decolonization. Like the world makers of decolonization, these political formations have returned to the task of rethinking our imperial past and present in the service of imagining an anti-imperial future. The article in Dissent, I think, builds precisely on that and fleshes that out. The second is a forthcoming article, but it's online and it's co-authored with our own Karuna Mantena, who is going to join in the conversation, in part because I want to bring this piece into our conversation. And as everybody knows, of course, Karuna Mantena is one of the foremost critical thinkers on Gandhi. And the article is titled Anti-Colonialism and the Decolonization of Political Theory. And it addresses the relationship between the critique of colonialism, especially the critique of the Eurocentric nature of Western political theory as taught in institutions like our own, the relationship between that critique and post-colonial theorizing of the present. And they argue there that there's a kind of paradoxical reauthorizing of Western thought that takes place in many of the anti-colonial critiques of the Eurocentrism of Western thought. And instead they urge for a focus and an attention to another dimension of post-colonial theory, the more reconstructive work of earlier anti-colonial thinkers like Gandhi and Fanon, or the more conceptual critical work of non-Western post-colonial theorists like our colleagues here at Columbia, Sudipta, Kaviraj, Partha Chatterjee, and Mahmoud Mamdani. So, we've linked to both of the articles on the resources tab of 213, and so you can find those there, and we'll come back to those articles. Adom Getachew is also the co-editor with Jennifer Pitts of a forthcoming book called Du Bois's International Thought, coming out in 2022, so we're really looking forward to that. And of course, Professor Getachew is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago. So we are thrilled to have you here. Before I turn the podium over to you, I just want to remind us where we were in our last seminar, which had led us to the point of posing about a certain number of questions, related questions, that can guide our discussion today of the writings of Nkrumah, James, and Padmore. The first question was, what, if any, difference is there between, on the one hand, the worldly philosophers situated in the context of a movement or an uprising, and the critical theorists located in a more intellectual or academic setting with regard specifically to their potential contributions to critique and praxis? In other words, as we read Nkrumah, James, and Padmore today, the question is, in what ways do their political actions and commitments shape or affect their contributions to critical theory and praxis? And in an introduction that I posted, and I hope you might have had a chance to look at, I proposed a few preliminary hypotheses, something about the idea that maybe in their work, the analysis of kind of crisis and critique, and they had brilliant critical insights into notions of neocolonialism, among others, but that work on crisis and critique was always twined directly, intimately, inextricably to an analysis of critique and praxis. And I think you see this clearly in the work that we're going to be looking at, particularly in Nkrumah's essays towards colonial freedom, where he is reformulating in a theoretical, practical way notions from Marx and transforming notions of the unification of the people of the colonies unite, right? Our variations, rethinking, reworking conceptual work that had been done. He talks about the building of a society of peoples in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Of course, we can see how that works. That raises a question, of course, about the relationship between praxis and other forms of action or theories of action, about strategies and tactics, something that Seyla Benhabib has been questioning and challenging in part the relationship between praxis, strategy, and tactics. And here too, it's possible that we might have some hypotheses about how this works out. I think that Adom has some suggestions. Then that raises another question, which is also, if indeed there is a difference, right? Then what are the mechanisms? How does it work? What are the implications of being situated physically, historically, etc., in struggle and rebellion? All right. So those are some of the animating questions, although they shouldn't serve as limitations on our discussion, but just some of the ways that we might be approaching this work. As I was rereading C.L.R. James's Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution today, actually I came upon this passage, which I hope we'll come back to, and then I'll pass the baton, but it's a passage on page 23, where C.L.R. James writes, and it had stuck with me, although I hadn't written about it, but it stuck with me, and at some point today, I want us to think about it. It's the final paragraph on page 23 where James writes, one final word about the form of the book, about the form the book has taken. Beginning with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and reaching a completion in Sartre, modern philosophy expresses its modernity by assuming the form of a personal response to extreme situations, and is no less philosophical for that. I record here a sequence of political responses to an extreme political situation, the African situation, as it has developed during the last 30 years. And so that's a kind of intriguing passage about personal versus political experiences, extreme situations, extreme political situations versus extreme situations without qualifications. And somehow I think that also is going to speak to us today. And so I'm hoping that we can come back to that later. But let me stop here. Hopefully you read all the posts, including Adom Getachew's initial intervention in her written blog post, which serve as an excellent prelude to the discussion. So let's begin, and let me turn the floor to you, But welcome to Revolution 213, and thank you so much, Adom.
Okay, thanks very much, Bernard. Is this on? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for that introduction and invitation, and also thanks to Fonda for making the arrangements to get me here. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'd like to, in my remarks, to expand on the blog post I wrote and situate the readings that from Nkrumah, Padmore, and James. I selected these three for two reasons. One, which I'll start with, is I think it indexes in some ways the collective and transnational intellectual and political project of which these three figures were a part, and that they were representatives of a wider kind of political world. The second is that through these texts, we encounter the Guinean revolution, what both Padmore and James refer to as a revolution, at three different moments. First, in Nkrumah's writing just before he joins the nationalist movement, as he's embarking on his return back to Ghana. A second time with Padmore in 1953, just after the first victories of the Convention People's Party that Nkrumah would run. And then finally in the 1970s, after the coup that has removed Nkrumah, and as at a moment of reassessing the limits and failures of the nationalist movement with James. So I want to start then with the collective and transnational intellectual and political project of which these figures were a part. I think it's important that while these figures are canonical and central figures, to understand them as part of a wider political world of debate linked by travel, by education, and most importantly, by the print cultures of the interwar period. Brent Hayes-Edwards, another colleague here at Columbia, and others have charted how the expansion of Black periodicals and journals in this period shaped the Black internationalist and anti-colonial thinking of a whole generation of figures. And these periodicals emerged not just in metropolitan circles in New York, in Paris, and London, but also in the colonies. And here, West Africa was central. Papers like the Gold Coast Leader, the Sierra Leone Weekly News, the Comet. And what was really striking also about the papers of West Africa was that they were often African owned, say unlike Southern Africa where settler interests controlled much of the print culture. This period is also one of an expansion, rapid expansion of literacy. So it means that while it's still a small group of people who can access these print cultures of this period, it's in a rapidly expanding one. And it would be a place where workers, activists, and intellectuals communicated with each other and debated. All of these figures were readers, writers, and editors of these various journals. So both Padmore and James would start journals at various moments. In fact, they would encounter each other, although they were both from Trinidad, encounter each other in writing before they met in London. So I think surfacing this context of writing makes clear how James and Nkrumah, Padmore, and others with whom they were in conversation understood themselves as making interventions in wide debates, and were preoccupied with a set of specific questions. I won't name all of them, but I think some of them that are central for me in my work are: one, what was the problem of empire? Two, what forms of political mobilization were appropriate to the colonial context? Three, what institutional structures might best realize the goal of self-determination or self-rule? And in later years, how should we understand the failures of the nationalist project? So I want to pause here and then ask, what does it mean to think of these texts as interventions? I think it means first attending to or reconstructing the audiences to which these interventions were a response to. Having a sense of that kind of political and intellectual community to which they understood themselves as responding to and debating with. I think this is also means that we have to attend not just to the content of their ideas, but the rhetorical strategies and tactics through which they wrote. This is a point in part elaborated by historians of political thought. Writing about Quentin Skinner's method in an essay titled "The Pen is a Mighty Sword," Jim Tully traces a way of thinking about political thought through what he calls the language of war, which highlights the tactics, strategies, opponents, battles, and controversies that structure philosophical and political debate. So I think this gives us a way of softening the distinction, one distinction between worldly and academic philosophers. In my blog post, I suggested one way of doing that with this set of figures is to remember in some ways that many of them did seek academic professions. Nkrumah started a PhD in philosophy before ending up a politician. Eric Williams, another figure, of course, spent a decade as a professor before becoming a statesman. So for them always, and we can return to this because James especially spends so much time thinking through the African intellectual and what the African intellectual was as a figure of politics. But here what I want to emphasize is that attending to these questions of strategy and tactics might give us a way of softening a distinction between sort of worldly or academic philosophers by attending to some of these genres of writing, these strategies and tactics that writing enables. That is to say that the way we read worldly philosophers might also help us read academic philosophers in a different kind of way. I think the other thing I just want to point out here is also that questions of strategy and tactics are also embedded in the project of theorization or generating theory. So that they're not only matters of what we do when we act out in the world, but that the whole project of theorization also involves a thinking about what strategies and tactics we use or these figures use in their writing as a way of persuading audiences, as a way of intervening in a set of public debates. So with that preamble, let me now turn to these three texts and what I think they're trying to do. So we'll start with Nkrumah, whose book Towards Colonial Freedom is published initially in 1947, but we have a 1962 edition where it gets much more wider circulation. And here we have a snapshot of Nkrumah before he takes power, before he's embedded in the nationalist project. And I raised this in the blog, but I'll point it out here too. I think one thing we might think about is disaggregating the category of worldly philosophers between those who eventually take state power, who end up becoming politicians, and those who remain perhaps embedded in social movements and political projects, but aren't in power. And James would be a kind of exemplary of that in this kind of trio of actors. So I think the book is trying to stage, Towards Colonial Freedom is trying to stage a particular critique of empire. And it does so at this moment right after the end of World War II, where again, it's not obvious that the decolonization movement will move as rapidly as it does, right? This is a moment, say, when debates about expanding trusteeship in the African context are dominant, where figures within the British colonial state are imagining that the colonization of Africa will go on for decades, if not a century more. So there's nothing in 1947 that suggests in 10 years that Ghana will be independent. And the critique that he puts forward first rejects a kind of an argument about benevolent alien rule. He argues that colonialism knows no laws beyond its own interests. And the implication here is that the distinction between different institutional forms, the mandate, the crown colony, the trusteeship, doesn't really matter. I think there's a second thing which becomes dominant for anti-colonial nationalists, is that an older distinction between empire, colonialism, and imperialism, which were understood to be distinct formations, say in J. Hobson's book, Imperialism, a study from 1902, that distinction is dissolved. So empire, in its modern iteration, and colonialism, imperialism are the same thing. And what it is, he argues, ultimately, is a form of economic exploitation, that its interest is extraction and exploitation. And this is the primary interest of colonialism. But if the diagnosis of what the problem of empire is an economic one primarily, his answer is a political one. He says, you know, even if its primary form is economic, what we have to do is transform. The transformation takes the shape of politics. We don't get this quote in this book, but he's, of course, would later put this by saying, "Seek ye first the political kingdom." And in here we get a kind of tripartite understanding of what that looks like: political freedom, i.e. sovereignty, democratic freedom, collective self-rule, self-determination, and social reconstruction. So I want to say also that I think broadly this formulation of what the problem of empire is one that emphasizes dependence, right? And it does so by one reading the international division of labor or the relationship of exploitation as one in which the colony is in various ways dependent on the metropole, dependent as its market, and kind of linked perpetually to a global market and global capital. Elsewhere, he develops this account of dependence as a more thoroughgoing account of what's wrong with colonialism. So in Africa Must Unite, he describes colonized peoples as sort of as lethargic, as incapable of kind of political action, because of this experience of dependence. So dependence is kind of organized concentrically almost at the international level and then within the colonial society. I think this diagnosis of what the problem of empire is, it creates an ambivalence vis-a-vis the colonized people, or often how he and Padmore and others also describe them as the masses. And the ambivalence is that on the one hand, there is a sense in which they are the agents of decolonization. They are the agents of transformation. The book ends with Colonial Peoples Unite, which you also pointed to in your blog, Bernard. But there's always this anxiety that the people are not ready, actually, to govern themselves. And this, of course, inaugurates the idea of the post-colonial state and the Nationalist Party as the pedagogues of the people, as the agents of transformation and improvement of the masses. And I think what James offers a really different account of the problem of empire, which I'll get to in a minute. So let me turn now to Padmore. Padmore served as Nkrumah's advisor of African affairs, and he was part of the first administration when Ghana became independent in 1957, and he served until his untimely death a few years later. This book, Gold Coast Revolution, comes out in 1953. It's 2 years after the first electoral contest that the Convention People's Party won, and it's 4 years before independence. So I think what's crucial about the work this book is trying to do is that it's an elaboration and legitimization of the Convention People's Party's political project. One, I think broadly, it reiterates Nkrumah's line about economic exploitation as the primary problem of empire, but a political institutional form as the solution to that. It also shares with James a sense that it's the popular mobilization that initiates the national project. And here they're both pointing to immediate post-war boycotts, protests, mobilizations in 1948. And it also begins to lay out some of the central dilemmas of this new nationalist project. One, and I think very crucially, is what the relationship will be between this new nationalist project, nationalist movement, and what he calls traditional authorities or chiefs. So on the one hand, there is a critique of the role of chiefs, of traditional authorities as intermediaries in the project of indirect rule, and a central line of both the Nkrumah estate and other kind of radical nationalist movements on the continent, that native authorities or chiefs were the kind of bastion of conservatism, of backwardness, of despotism within the territory, within the colony. In this particular book, we get one kind of answer to that, which is that what the nationalist project is trying to do is not abolish chieftaincy, but to restore what they and what Padmore and others around them believed were the kind of traditional popular checks on the chief, which had been kind of undermined by the colonial state. So this, this kind of conflict, and we can talk more about this conflict between the chiefs and Nkrumah, which is the topic of a book by Richard Rathbone also, would become one of the central fulcrums that leads to the centralization of the state. And it's in this conflict between the new state, the new post-colonial state, and traditional authorities that we get one site of increasing centralization. The second kind of dilemma that he points to is what he calls at the end irredentist nationalisms, these subnational formations that seek their own autonomy or have different conceptions of what the political and territorial unit should be. And in particular, he names the Iwe, who are an ethnic group that exists both in Ghana and in Togo, and these imaginations of pan-Iwe identity. And of course, this would be another kind of site of conflict in the new nation state. Sorry if I'm going too long. Okay, I'll just briefly go over James. So we encountered James here in the 1970s. James had been briefly a member of the People's National Movement, Eric Williams's party in Trinidad. And there he edited the party's organ, The Nation, before resigning in 1960. And he actually sent his resignation letter from Ghana, where he was visiting at the time. His reasons for resigning at that time emerged again from what becomes the central argument of this book as well, about the increasing centralized structure of the party and what he perceived as the party's usurpation of the autonomy of the nation to publish what it wanted. He also had a vision of kind of restructuring the party that Williams refused to sign on to. So, so this concern with centralization, and he calls it at one point the Nkrumah state a totalitarian state, would be sort of the central, like he's trying to figure out how this happened, why this happened, and that's the question of this book. But before getting there, he reconstructs for us what made the revolution a revolution. And here, his story is very similar to the one he tells in Black Jacobins, of course, his classic text on the Haitian Revolution. So again, like Padmore, he argues that it's mass mobilization that initiates the anti-colonial revolution. He has a great line that, the British think it's Achimota College, which is where Nkrumah and all the nationalists were trained, that started the revolution, but it's really the market women, right, who are the social base of the revolution. And so there you can tell the echoes of the masses beginning, the San Domingo masses beginning in Black Jacobins. Like Black Jacobins, he also is interested, this is also a book about leadership. And he's interested in thinking about Nkrumah and the party not so much as initiating popular mobilization but as mirroring the masses' actions and then somehow directing it through that process of mirroring. I think this raises the question of how to understand Nkrumah and the other nationalist figures as a kind of class. And he characterizes them as part of a kind of intellectual class, the African intellectual. And I think here we see a magnification and intensification of what David Scott has called the tragedy of colonial enlightenment in his reading of James's Black Jacobins. These are a cohort who are the products of Western civilization, he says, and they are alienated from the nations they would come to govern. So this gap, however, between the African intellectual as the product of the West and the nation is not a problem. It's not a problem that James characterizes as one of kind of inauthentic leadership. But rather that the transformation that these leaders seek is one that seeks to reproduce or imitate the West. So there's a critique of the language of catching up with the West. And he says Nkrumah, above all, represents this tendency to seek to reproduce Western society in Ghana. And it's the process of this ambition, he argues, that reinforces the centralization of the state. So early in the book, he has this meditation on the one-party state. And he says, many critics focus on the one-party part. And he's like, that's not the problem. The problem is the state. And I think here, in this concern about the state, we get a different diagnosis of what the problem of empire was. So for Nkrumah, if dependence is the primary problem, the state becomes an agent of transformation. It becomes, in various ways, the mechanism through which independence, sovereign independence, of course, but also the independence of the people can be secured. But for James, what characterizes imperialism is a form of arbitrary or despotic rule. And the problem with the kind of transition to the nationalist state is that state infrastructure was never transformed. There's a kind of continuity of this despotic mechanism now in new hands. So with that, I'll just stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Adom. So there were a couple of gems in your presentation that I just wanted to pick up on. The first was this suggestion you made that maybe the way we read the worldly philosophers in terms of their strategies and tactics, or the focus on strategies and tactics that we have in the context of the worldly philosophers, because they seem so much more clearly engaged in discussion of strategy and tactics, that could actually help us to better interpret or to interpret more richly the kind of the critical theory interventions that are made by more academic oriented critical theorists, right? So that actually, I think that's a brilliant idea of kind of how the difference actually could help us read other critical theory. And so I think that's right. I mean, the example I immediately think of course, but it's a slightly different context. But in reading, for instance, the Foucault of 1971-72, where he's engaging, for instance, in 72 in penal theories and institutions, right? 7 lectures on the revolt and the repression of the Nu-Pieds rebellion in Normandy in 1639, which are in some way intended to be an intervention in what was going on in France in 1971. Right, so obviously there are strategies and tactics of writing that are very different. Right, a lot of people were explicitly addressing 1971, and that was a typical strategic piece of Foucault's arsenal, was to always send us back to some distant period which did not seem in any way to relate, or that was not directly in conversation, but that actually was the best way to see how repression functions. Right, it was in the 1639 repression that you could see the way in which kind of the military and the criminal system fused. And so it gave us particular insights on the criminal system as a way of turning people into criminal others through a military process. So, I mean, in other words, so there, I think that's right, that we could actually maybe, that insight would then transform how we read critical theorists. But in a way, the question that raises to my mind is, yeah, I mean, it is a question of keeping your eyes on the prize in a way. In other words, sometimes it seems to me that some of the strategies and tactics may be, what are they oriented to, even within the critical theorist arsenal? Are they really oriented toward transforming the world in the same way in which the worldly philosopher has their sights on? Or are those strategies and tactics involved in a different struggle, maybe a struggle with other intellectuals at the time, or presenting something as my worry is, the question is, would be, what is the prize in the struggle and the tactics in these different spaces? So that's, I think, a very provocative and helpful intervention. The second one was to this disaggregating of what we're calling worldly philosophers. I think that's very provocative and very interesting. Those who become, or those who take power, those who accede to power in some form, willingly or unwillingly, or find themselves in a position, versus those who always remain on the outside, right, as critics, someone like C.L.R. James. Now, those are choices, I take it, and somehow it could be that we're talking about a dimension of both critical theorists and worldly philosophers that is a choice to remain outside. And it's, of course, it's a choice that is not just the choice of worldly philosophers can make, or critical theorists, but all thinkers can, right? I mean, it's that choice of whether we decide to operate from within an institution and acquire the forms of power or other attributes that allow us to operate within an institution, or whether one always stays outside. So this is obviously not an attribute just of worldly philosophers, nor of critical thinkers, but liberal thinkers as well, right? Do you go into the Biden administration, right? So many, that's a question, right? And what does that mean? How does one achieve what one is thinking for? For instance, in the Guantanamo context, right? Is there, do you continue to stay outside? If there are possibilities, obviously, in some administrations there aren't possibilities, but in some administrations there are possibilities. Do you do that work of then entering into the administration or do you stay outside as the gadfly? And we have that you use the gadfly expression, and that is another important decision. And I'm not, so I don't know if we're getting a 2x4 here. worldly philosopher, academic critical theorist, and then, within the institution, outside the institution, or if there's something else that's going on. In any event, I think that's something we can push on more. And then your final discussion of kind of like what is referred to by C.L.R. James as the African intellectual, and this tension between being a product of the West and on the other hand being possibly alienated from the nation. And I actually, in reading these materials, I felt it more uncomfortable sometimes with C.L.R. James than with Nkrumah, in the sense that I felt more uncomfortable at times reading C.L.R. James and thinking that there was a conversation with Marxism and with the Soviet experience and with Lenin that was so strong, so almost stronger in staying within a certain Western tradition. And I know in your essay, Adom and Karuna, you suggest that they were actually trying to create more ambiguity, reconception, reuse of concepts. But I found that in the James readings in work, more of a falling back within a structure of Marx and Lenin that seemed to create that tension. But the last thing I want to do, though, before turning it back to you, Adom and Karuna, and then opening it up, is to actually think about your piece on decolonizing political theory. Because, and this is a brilliant piece, it's not out yet, it's forthcoming, but the draft is online, so you can all read it, and we pointed to it. It's going to be coming out in Critical Times, called AntiColonialism and the Decolonization of Political Theory. I feel as if it's almost a test of our hypotheses, or a possible test. It's almost a natural experiment. You offer a natural experiment in that text, because you basically structure it in three parts, in which you then engage three different sets of theorists. The first one is the writings of two non-Western worldly philosophers, Fanon and Gandhi, right? And their critique of colonialism. The second part addresses the writings of three Western academic critical theorists, Susan Buck-Morss, Amy Allen, and James Tully, on their critique of the Eurocentrism of political theory. And then the third addresses the writings of three non-Western post-colonial theorists, Sudipta, Kaviraj, Partha Chatterjee, and Mahmoud Mamdani, and on kind of post-colonial reconceptualizations. Now, briefly, for those who haven't yet read the piece, the argument is essentially, tell me if I got this wrong, but a brief recap is that too many of the recent attempts at decolonizing political theory fall back on a critique of the Eurocentrism of Western political thought that unintentionally reauthorizes the Western writings and Western models of universality. And that instead, what you propose is that we decenter Western political thought more radically and successfully by focusing on the more positive, constructive agenda of anti-colonial thought, Gandhi and Fanon, or the reconceptualization work of post-colonial theorists. So, and of course, in making this argument, there's this dual nature of critique as having both the critical project and the reconstructive project. This is the dual nature of anti-colonial and post-colonial critiques, as having that. And you suggest, and so here's the point. here's the point. You seem to suggest, and this is very provocative and very interesting, that for the first set, which are the worldly philosophers, Fanon and Gandhi, that they succeeded in developing kind of constructive critiques of colonialism that turned our attention towards their reconstructive critical praxis. Okay? And in part, I think you suggest that that worked because they were more situated. The notion of situatedness is a recurring theme in your discussion of those two authors, those two worldly philosophers. It was a situated mode of theorizing, and there were the specificities of the colonial context. They were taking the standpoint of the colonized. So something about, I would say, for those worldly philosophers, their work is valued because it's situated, reconstructive, praxis-oriented. The second group, in a way, you're more critical of, because the critical theorists, I think the terms that I would associate with them, by contrast to kind of situatedness of the world philosophers, is abstract, self-referential, and limited, which are the characterization in the sense that, and the critique there, I think, is that by trying to understand the kind of anti-colonial critique within the Western tradition, or that it reinserts it within those parameters. And so this is like a bit of a critique of Susan Buck-Morss's work on Haiti and Hegel and Haiti, in which ultimately we're back with Hegel as the lodestar that serves to legitimate, in a way, the attention to the Haitian Revolution. So the self-referential there means that it's a return ultimately to a Western standpoint. And then the third set, who are non-Western post-colonial theorists, here we are still in the academy, right? We're right here at Columbia. Kaviraj, Chatterjee, and Mamdani, all three at Columbia University. Now, I would say that your evaluation of them is that they are involved in conceptual innovation, conceptual reanimation. Those are the terms, the guiding terms for those set of thinkers. And so the ideas of conceptual innovation and reanimation here, for instance, the idea of political society with Chatterjee, as distinguished from civil society, or the idea of bifurcated state you read about in Mamdani's work. And I would say that the key terms here are conceptual, new concepts, analytic and critical categories. And so we almost have a bit of a natural experiment, because we end up with worldly philosophers on the one hand who are situated, reconstructive, and practice-oriented, critical theorists who are abstract, self-referential, and more critique-oriented rather than praxis, I would say, and then post-colonial theorists who are conceptual, innovative, but also in a way critique-oriented still. So is it possible to use those frameworks to draw distinctions, or should we not generalize from this particular circumstance? Could we generalize, or should we not generalize? Like, it could be something completely different. It could be an artifact of our times, right? And you mentioned that, right? These were different times. The promise is eclipsed, or Gandhi and Fanon were writing at a very different time and had a much more ambitious horizon, in part that has been somewhat, rendered more complicated today. So is it just, it might just be a question of timing. On the other hand, right, is this actually telling us something about potential differences along those axes that you draw of the critical versus the reconstructive project, situatedness, abstraction, self-referentiality, and conceptuality. Okay, and then at some point I want to get back to that C.L.R. James quote about Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre, but I don't know if, but maybe we'll leave that for later.
Okay.
But so, Adom, let me give you a chance to kind of address these questions, and then Karuna, I thought maybe you could jump in as well as co-author of that piece, and then we can open it up for discussion.
Great. Okay, before getting to the question about the article, I wanted to say a couple of things about your earlier comments. You know, your point about Foucault's writings from 1971 and 72 remind me also about the centrality of history to the figures I write about. So it's very striking that in the 1930s moment, as James is thinking about the African Revolution, he writes a book about Haiti, and he very explicitly says he's writing this book to think through, you know, the coming revolution in Africa. And that period in general, the 1930s period, as I write about in my book, was a period in which a number of works trying to think about the history of slavery emerged. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery. And I guess I think, you know, there is this way of thinking about the relationship between the past and present, a set of arguments that emerge from those histories of slavery that are trying to both make sense of the present and also, trace out the possibilities for the future. And I guess I think, you know, when we started, you called me a critical theorist, and I don't really think of myself in those terms. In some ways, because I think of myself as doing this work of historical reconstruction, as taking on this lesson about the importance of the relationship between past and present. And I'm not saying that's not a critical theory tool, but it strikes me as a different kind of practice, perhaps, than the one that emerged traditionally out of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. And maybe you'll object, but it has more, I guess, more closely related to Foucault in that sense. The second thing is just about James and Western civilization. You know, I think the importance, the way he wants to read it, at the end he says, you know, something like Lenin, Mao, Nehru, and Nkrumah, we ought to think about them as similar figures, and they have done more to transform the world in the 20th century than anybody else. And I guess I think what he's after in some way in reading the Ghana Revolution through the Russian Revolution is a way of thinking about how, I mean, Russia was for many anti-colonial nationalists an exemplary revolution, in part because it was the story of a revolution in a non-industrialized society. And this question about how to mobilize peasantries and how to think about a socialist or communist project in a space that was not fully industrialized would be a central one for James and others. So I think there's in here, I mean, this is maybe connected to the point we're making about the post-colonial theorists too. There's a comparative element to the project that James is engaged in, and also Padmore. Padmore ends by thinking about the relationship between the nationalist project in Ghana and the nationalist project in India. So I think maybe we can think about comparison also of a certain kind as one practice that these theorists, worldly theorists, engage in. So an attempt to think through a set of dynamics that are playing not just in Ghana, but can be kind of have resonance beyond Ghana. He says this a couple of times too, that, you know, he has a critique of a very prominent Ghanaian historian, David Apter, and he says he treats Ghana like a specimen, right? That has it's this that's particularistic, right? It's just, it has nothing to teach the rest of the world. And so there's something about the interest in comparison and the interest in generalizability or universality emerging out of the post-colonial world or the decolonizing world that I think is part of what he's also after in the kind of constant reference to Russia. You know, I think on the essay, I think in many ways, yes, your characterization of the three parts is right. I mean, I think what we want to say about the first and third group, the anti-colonial nationalists or Fanon and Gandhi in the first part, and the post-colonial theorists in the third part, is they share this, even if the contemporary figures they don't look, there's no horizon in which decolonization is in the future, at least not in the same ways as it was for Gandhi and Fanon. They share a reconstructive project, an attempt to think about, you know, how to characterize these societies, right? What the dynamics of these colonial and now post-colonial societies are, and that this attempt to think through the specificity of these political spaces and the trajectories of these spaces does connect these two moments. I think the other thing, especially...
Hold on, can I just ask for a clarification?
Yeah.
The two moments, are you talking about Gandhi and Fanon? That's what they share.
Sorry, and the post-colonial
theories? Okay.
I mean, it may take a different form, right? It's not, of course, the figures in the present aren't leading nationalist parties or trying to figure out how to mobilize the masses in a direct sense. But I think what I mean by they share a kind of reconstructive project is, I think they're interested in understanding these societies on their own terms and trying to figure out both, I think, to understand why that project of nationalist revolution failed, right? What accounts for that failure, and how to think critically about those societies in this contemporary moment. And I think they have different relationships to the question of a kind of forward-looking project. So in his latest work, I think we say this, I think Mamdani kind of takes up the question of decolonization again to think about what might decolonization require or look like in the present. So there is this maybe forward-looking ambition there too.
Okay, great. Before Karuna, I get the mic and pass it to you, just a quick some footnotes. So two small footnotes to your first response,
Mm-hmm.
which was about C.L.R. James in part. And the first one is you know, just a citation to support what you were saying, right? I mean, so, and he refers to these passages again, actually, in the Nkrumah introduction, but like the conclusion, the final, you know, paragraphs of, you know, Black Jacobins are precisely as you suggested, right? And it's reading history in order to, it's a history of the present, but it's almost a comparative history. It's a, you know, he writes, the blacks of Africa are more advanced, nearly ready, than were the slaves of San Domingo, right? I mean, this is it's really kind of making a connection to the present in that way. And the second footnote has to do just with the use of critical theorist here. So of course, I'm not gonna, you get to decide, of course, but I wasn't using the term critical theorist as just the Frankfurt School. So I was using it. So maybe the term that interests me more is contemporary critical thought than critical theorist, if it's limited to the Frankfurt School. But contemporary critical thinker doesn't always sound as thinker doesn't sound as good as theorist or something. So, but anyway, you get to decide on that one, of course. But I am using the term in a broader sense, right? Okay. And then one footnote to the last. To your last point about your essay before we go to Karuna, I did read the third part regarding post-colonial theorists as having a different relationship to the reconstruction than the worldly philosophers Gandhi and Fanon. And I was searching for the reconstructive in there, and I wasn't finding it as much. So maybe it's just my reading of it, but it remained at a very conceptual level, which I agree is internal to the situation. So it's not referential to Western political thought, but I felt that it remained in a very conceptual domain, the conceptual interventions that that seem still not as reconstructive as the worldly philosophers. But that's just my reading. And so, but definitely, yes, Karuna. Thank you, Adrian. Thanks so much.
Hi. Thank you. I feel conscripted.
Yes, sorry, interpolated more than that. Yes, cold called or something.
Yes,
I don't know.
So I just wanted to say it's great. This is a wonderful discussion. So I'm just going to say one thing about the article and ask a couple of quick questions. I mean, the thing. So the article, I think I would say the only thing I would say is, it was a very specific purpose. It's really a very, it's an article focused on what to do with anti-colonialism for political theory. So it's very disciplinary. It's very academic in that sense. It's endpoint. I think if we were writing it, so it isn't really an assessment of the worldly philosophic, or if we were writing it about revolution, we would put on a different hat and we would write a different. It would be a different set of thinkers.
You mean if you were writing
about
for Revolution 1313, if it were a text for revolution,
yeah,
or,
I mean,
or what do you mean if you were writing about revolution?
Like if we were interested in political theorists writing for revolution today, we would probably maybe pick up a different set of writers as well, because in a way we were trying to figure out the connection between what it means to recover anti-colonial thought and study it, as we are all doing now, for political theory. What's at stake, what would be the conceptual innovations possible. So just on the last point, then I think our critique in a way, so you very kindly reconstructed our critique, but I think on the point of the post-colonial theorists, what we meant by reconstruction there is that they're doing a work of conceptual reconstruction. So you're right, and I think we would say they don't have the same political horizon, imagination, or project that Gandhi or Fanon did, but they are doing something more than just diagnostic or critique. They're trying to come up with categories to understand the nature of society, of decolonizing or post-colonial societies today as a precursor, I think, for many of them, to action. I mean, in some sense, I think there is some idea that unless you have a real diagnostic set of categories that actually can make sense of a present that's hard to discern for lots of reasons, a political project can't be built. And in fact, I would say the original subaltern studies group, and if Sudipta's here, he can say it himself, but part of their critique of Western categories was precisely that. Not of course they're Eurocentric, but really the problem is if they don't capture a truth in Indian society today, then new political projects aren't possible. And so I think that might be a connection with critical theory in the sense of a relationship between a diagnostic capacity to understand the nature of a society and the possibility of transforming it in new political direction. So I think there is a potential there, but I don't think all of the writers have, we are still pausing at this moment of conceptual work. So that's all I would say there. And maybe just sort of connecting back to some of the themes of Nkrumah and James and Padmore is I do think this might be an interesting thing to think about, maybe disaggregate critique a little bit more and think, I think what Adom's work really shows really nicely is this relationship between diagnosis. Like when you really break down critique, it's really what I really love about the work today and also from the book is really saying we are, all of them posit a certain analysis of colonialism or empire, or maybe actually I would ask more about James's later construction of it as despotism of some kind, that really is pushing, the diagnosis is connected then to spurring a kind of action as well. So so I like that. I was just curious how to think about diagnosis as much as critique. And so the substantive question would be, in this analysis of imperialism, as you say, all of them do shift to collapsing empire, imperialism, colonialism. But I wondered how much in James or Padmore kept the older, in Hobson, the older kind of legacy of that language of imperialism was a connection, some people say, to sort of a Bonapartism or imperialism as a kind of, it is a precursor term, or it goes alongside, especially in the interwar years, still a resonance with fascism or totalitarianism or despotism. So I'm just curious how much of that resonance is earlier in James or in any of these other writers, or does it reemerge later? And then I guess the other question just about worldly philosophers and these thinkers, I thought the other point might be helpful is what Adom emphasized too, which is thinking about this wonderful account of the periodic culture and the newspapers, and it really audiences. So I think that seems to be the big difference. Like even if Eric Williams is teaching in a university, his audiences are still this broader political reading public, and that might be another way. It's not so much it's not, I think, just where the writer or intellectual is situated at an academy or in the party office, but when they write, who's their audience and what kind of questions they take up, and they might sit in more than one space.
Yeah.
But I think that's the idea of that's one way of thinking of the situatedness. And then I guess the last thing I would just say about, this comes back to the first point, and I'll just say this. The other thing I often think of as situatedness, and maybe it's this anti-colonial moment, and it's connected to all of these diagnostic and reconstructive, is looking for, part of, I think, the need to understand like the historical reconstruction of these societies or think comparatively is also to, again, a kind of classical critical social theory move is to try to find an immanent source, an immanent social force, like an immanent moment in these societies in which the spark of change comes from. So I think that's sort of the other way of thinking of, like Gandhi and Fanon are diagnosing their own societies to find this source of transformation. And I think that might be, that's also the interesting thing that all these thinkers are doing in their historical reconstruction and comparison, is trying to, again, I think there's something, to me, the worldliness that interests me is how grounded they are in thinking historically, sociologically, in the crevices of these societies in order to find this, find and argue and construct these forms of action or institutions that can come out.
Adom, before I turn to you, though, just to pick up, there was one thing that created a question in my mind for both of you. You don't have to answer it now. Maybe you can think about it, but I would love to know. You were saying if you had chosen worldly philosophy for the third category, if you had chosen revolutionaries, you would have chosen someone else than our colleagues here. But who would those be today? Would be the question I would ask. In other words, what would be that category? Because I think that would be a great fourth category for your essay, but it surely would also be a great category for us in Revolution 1313. So think about that. I don't want to put you on the spot right now, but who would those contemporary, revolutionary, worldly philosophers be today that we would read in this context, in this lineage of, Fanon Gandhi, 1990s, 2000 aughts, critical theory, 2010 post-colonial theory. And so who would be those worldly philosophers today that we would look at on the ground. Okay, so if at some point I'd like to hear on that,
Okay.
but I don't want to put you on the spot. We go ahead, Adom.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I think this question of diagnosis is really important, and it makes me think that I too strongly stated my self-distancing from critical theory, because I mean, in Critique, Norm, and Utopia, Seyla Benhabib starts with this disaggregation, right? There's a moment of critical diagnosis and then a normative utopian moment, and those two are entangled. And I really do think this diagnostic part is central to understanding anti-colonial thought. And in fact, when I think our kind of in the essay, the other thing we do is try to describe what it means to kind of model a form of how one does this reconstruction. So one has to think about what are these figures diagnosing in their world? How do they understand this set of problems? And that generates both, in the book I try to show, it generates a vision of decolonization that requires this international transformation as much as it does a domestic one. But I think another thing we might do is, I think it's true that we ought to think of anti-colonial thought as a tradition of thought, as one that shares a lot of similarities, and that's another reason to bring Fanon and Gandhi together in the same essay. But I think it's also worth disaggregating how they might have the same question, but actually they answer in different kinds of ways, and the ways they answer, they generate their diagnoses of what the problem of empire is, actually then means that the way they think about both who the agents of transformation are, what the goal of what the goal of something like self-determination is, what institutional and political forms it ought to take, really are divergent, right? And so it's worth thinking then about the anti-colonial thought as kind of internally variegated and rich in a set of people. There isn't one kind of telos or trajectory to that tradition of thought. And asking this question of diagnosis or what the problem is to which they're responding, it really illuminates those differences. And I think, again, that's part of what I tried to show with the Nkrumah and James difference. I think too, this question about whether this earlier kind of language of Bonapartism remains, I think you do see this especially in Padmore's, not in this book so much, but in How Britain Rules Africa, an earlier book, which invents, or I don't know if he's the first to use it, but he uses this language of colonial fascism in that context. And it's an argument, of course, made more better known to us perhaps through Arendt or Amy Césaire in the post-war period, but it's this early argument about the forms of authoritarianism and in the colony, all right, and again in the British Empire in particular. And I think one version of that is this a kind of common, that Padmore elaborates it in that book, but it shows up in a number of other texts of the period, is this kind of fusion of executive and especially judicial power. All right, that's the kind of central part of what makes imperial rule particularly despotic. So I think that does remain, and I think it's true also that figures around Nkrumah, say the person who was the first representative of Ghana in the UN, Alex Quaison-Saki, writes a book called Africa Unbound, where he makes the same argument about this fusion of especially executive and judicial rule, and he locates it. There's two figures for these set of writers that kind of represent that: the district officer, so the kind of most proximate representative of the colonial state, and then the native authority or the chief. And there it's an argument also about how colonial rule transformed existing systems of popular checks on native authorities. And this is sort of where this argument we get in Padmore here comes from, the idea that what the nationalist movement is trying to do is it's not like sweep away existing institutions, native institutions, but restore them actually to their former kind of structure of checks, popular checks on chiefly authority. Yeah, I want to say one thing about the periodicals, because I think, this question of audience also means that people are experimenting with genre a lot, right? They write in, so I'm working on a project on Garveyism now, and if you read the Negro World, which circulated a lot, it includes poetry alongside, opinion pieces. There's, a section where divisions of the movement kind of report what they're doing. So these are figures who write in a multiplicity of genres. James wrote a novel first and foremost before he wrote Black Jacobins. And I think also these shorter forms, the opinion piece, the essay, are attempts to try and both reach a wider audience, but also to experiment with different forms, to think about this question of the strategies of writing, and practice them in a variety of modalities. I don't know if I answered all the questions there.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we're going to open it up, and I think, Che, have you got do you want to jump in, or was that
Thanks so much, Adom. This was really rich. Yeah, I think my questions are a bit maybe still forming, but I just want to say first off that I really appreciated this language of softening, the distinction between critical and worldly philosophers. And I guess my questions are maybe two. The first is that your talk kind of made me think about literature and the literary and the genre and reading political texts. And it also made me think about the work of Brent Hayes Edwards and the practice of diaspora, where he looks at various genres of the political in the context of Black internationalism. And he argues that Black radicalism is internationalism because he's tracing these networks for Padmore between France and the United States. And so, it made me think of Mbekdar writing to Du Bois in 1946, saying he was a student of the Negro problem, i.e. of Black study. And so my first question is, in terms of the international and world making, are there moments that you see potentiality within these networks that aren't only about the national struggle for self-determination, but a kind of planetary imaginary that is shaped by Black radical internationalism that takes it beyond and outside the nation state and figures decolonization in a different way, like a different geopolitics? Yeah. And my second question is sort of about Gandhi and who's been critiqued. There was the University of Ghana students and faculty took down a statue of Gandhi. There was Gandhi must fall hashtag. So I guess I'm wondering how to grapple with those kind of tensions around writings, around more public attention to Gandhi and anti-Blackness, and maybe how not to throw out the Gandhian, baby with the bathwater, basically. So I'm just curious about how to reconcile those things. Thanks.
Great.
Let me just add, though, before you get to that I see that we're joined by our colleagues, Sudipta, Kaviraj on Zoom, and Seyla Benhabib as well. And so I just want to invite you to intervene if you would like to as well on the next. So you can just wave at me. No, on the first one there. There we go. So you just wave at me, and we'll let you in next. Adom, do you want to
Okay, sure.
address
Yeah.
that?
Thanks for these questions. I think in many respects, it's true that the period that I look at, especially in the book, is the post 1945 moment. So it is a moment, even if it is internationalist, it's one in which the terms of that internationalism have been shaped by the nation state, right? Even the imaginations of federation are ones already that are structured by thinking about it's an interstate project as much as it is an international project. So I do think, and as Brent Hayes Edwards and others have shown, that it is really, I think the interwar period is the richest moment in many ways, in part because I think these questions of the kind of institutional form of the end of empire is as yet undecided, right? I mean, again, some of the work I'm doing now about Garveyism is an attempt to try to think through that openness. I mean, I think one thing that's really striking about, especially if you look at Garveyism, is that a lot of times that alternative is still couched in the language of empire, right? In a couple of ways. One, the persistence of kind of imaginations of imperial citizenship or imperial subjecthood in the British Empire, and scholars of the French Empire have shown how that gets transformed into visions of French citizenship after the war as well. But I think one is to think about the ways in which imperial attachment and affiliation, and also then a reimagining of empire as a Black empire, as Michelle Stevens has shown, kind of continues or remains a kind of reoccurring fixture of this period. I think another kind of geopolitical form that that actually Nkrumah himself participates in really up until the end, really up until the 1940s, is a vision of a West Africa, a united West Africa. And the first nationalist party of the interwar period in the region is a National Congress of British West Africa that tries to think about the territories together. One of the epigraphs that starts towards colonial freedom is taken from J.E. Casely Hayford, who was one of the founders of this. So that's a second kind of geopolitical imaginary of this earlier moment. A third, and this will get us to the Gandhi point, is an early kind of paper called the African Times and Orient Review, which is started by Egyptian journalist Dusay Muhammad Ali. And what's really striking about that paper, again, which is already stated in the title, African Times and Orient Review, is that it thinks of itself as articulating a Pan-African and Pan-Oriental vision within the seat of the British Empire is its sort of tagline. And I think what's really interesting about that is to both how kind of Black internationalism or Pan-Africanism intersects and is entangled with these other pan movements of this period, rather than simply isolated or disaggregated. And yeah, how to think about that, kind of intersection or entanglement would be one other kind of avenue to pursue. I think what's really striking about that paper, it starts in 1912, it's published until about 1920, is how it tries to kind of map out all these, spaces and sites of the darker nations' resistance, right? And Gandhi appears in that context for his work in South Africa. So I guess, I would say that, on the question of Gandhi, I think looking at these earlier moments about the ways in which people imagine their struggles, not necessarily always as the same struggle, but as overlapping and requiring one another's solidarities would be one place to start. I mean, a second is just to think about how significant Gandhi and Gandhian nonviolence was for the project of African decolonization. I mean, Nkrumah's vision of positive positive action is drawn very much directly from Gandhian nonviolence. So, you know, I think especially in this particular moment, it'd be worth kind of remembering and reconstructing, recovering those histories. Yeah.
Thanks, Adom. Also, I want to welcome Brent Edwards, who's here with us too. We were just talking about the practice of diaspora. So thanks, Brent, for being here. And if you want to intervene, although, shall we turn next? Did someone, did anyone on Zoom want to jump in? Sudipta, if you want to, or
someone has their hand up.
Seyla, somebody has is there a hand up? I can't, I'm having a hard time seeing.
Yeah, in the top corner.
Hi, thanks so much, Adom, Bernard, and Karuna for your comments. And Adom, it's nice to see you again. I took a few courses with you like 3 years ago in Chicago, so this is an exciting encounter. I just wanted to return to the question of audience, potentially as a means of addressing Bernard's first, framing question about the distinction between worldly philosophers and academic critical theorists vis-a-vis, their contributions to critique and praxis. There was a really great line. This was on page 64 of the James piece, where James is talking about the impact of what Nkrumah did in Ghana and the revolution, and he says it is not only that Nkrumah carried it being like his political vision to the Gold Coast, it is that the people of the Gold Coast accepted it so completely that gives it international significance. So I wanted to return to the question of audience, I guess, because this seems like a step beyond the typical, theory praxis distinction. Here, it feels to me like there is an additional step. Like, is it not just from theory to praxis, but from praxis then to popular, not just bearing witness, but sort of a positive popular reception of the theory and then the praxis. Is that something that makes a worldly philosopher in contradistinction maybe to someone who's intervening, purely in an academic debate, and acknowledging that it's worth softening that distinction. So, I don't want to be disparaging or anything, but I just wondered, if this question of audience and sort of popular reception seemed like something worth contemplating to any of the speakers. And thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Should I get
Adom,
okay,
you
sure.
wanna-
Yeah,
And
thanks.
then, or is that a two finger, or it is a two finger? Okay,
can-
no,
no,
let's
go
do
for
that.
it.
Let's go. Alyssa Battistoni.
And I'm happy to be here in person this time. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. This has been really great. And my question, I went into two finger on the audience question, but sort of in a different direction and almost in some ways in the opposite direction, which is to think about not only how the worldly philosopher is sort of transmitting ideas or conveying ideas. And I do love what you say, Adom, about persuasion and sort of conveying, using writing as a way of that there are strategies to writing and all of that. I completely agree. But I guess I'm also thinking about sort of the reverse side of a sort of accountability to movements and to popular projects and to being situated within a movement or project, whether it's the party or the state even, where you have some kind of commitment that other people can sort of ask you to deliver on or expect you to sort of play a role in, including perhaps through the kinds of things you're writing and maybe the essays or the op-eds or whatever, and the way that kind of I guess a feedback that comes back from the movement and from that situatedness, and not only sort of from the thinker to the masses, as I think the audience frame sometimes would suggest. So I would love to hear But all three of you have to say about that, and anyone else.
Okay, I'll take up Alyssa's question and then get to Ishan's. You know, I think one thing about maybe that's helpful here is what James says about Nkrumah's political education. He doesn't spend, you know, he again downplays the kind of institutional education he received, and he's like, he wasn't even made by the writers he read, but instead he was made by being in the United States and being embedded in African American political struggle. He's like, this is the most, it's vanguardist in a different kind of way, but this, the African American struggle in the United States is sort of the kind of exemplary one of the wider global struggle, right? And it's his embeddedness in social movements here that shaped his own kind of understanding of what organizing is, etc. I forget where in the text that comes up. So I think that's another thing about what's important about the kind of collaborative character of something like a journal or a periodical that's different from, you know, the book, even though I chose books for today, but that one is, you know, these are kind of, one is shaped by a set of dialogues and conversations, and that also was a form of political education, worldly education, through which someone like Nkrumah and others passed. I mean, I think these questions of how to think about accountability are really good, and I don't have an answer. I have to think about that. I guess to get to Ishan's question, I think, you know, that chapter where you quoted from, it's called The Revolution in Theory. And it's, again, begins with this critique of David Apter's The Gold Coast in Transition. And he says, you know, that Apter thinks that what Nkrumah did is operate through charisma, and he kind of reenacted or embodied the role of the chief, and that's how he was able to mobilize the masses. But what the CPP does, he goes on to show, and others have elaborated, is that it was able to capture a set of kind of or existing mobilizations, antagonisms, disaffections in the society, and link them together. And perhaps its greatest success, which distinguished it from most nationalist parties, is that it in fact built a rural-urban connection, right? So it managed to link up this class of often called in the literature of this period, the primary school leavers, people who were able to secure a primary school education but had no avenues beyond that, and who were kind of like Nkrumah himself, not connected to the structures of chiefly authority. So those set of figures and a set of already existing kind of protests and mobilizations against native authorities in the rural side. So it's by linking both a kind of urban, underemployed, unemployed, but literate in some ways, urban class, and this kind of initial set of mobilizations or protests of native authority, that the CPP does build a nationalist party. And so I guess that's a way of thinking about the kind of, another way of kind of elaborating James's point about the struggle having already started with these mobilizations on the ground, and what the party does is kind of articulate them together in a particular way through the party.
Right. And a question I would have there, although I want to pass it next to Seyla Benhabib, who's going to join us from Zoom, is where exactly the notion of getting to the rural population and sympathizers would fit in the relationship between praxis, strategy, and tactics. But let me go to Seyla Benhabib on Zoom. Welcome.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
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 Wonderful to see you.
Great to see you.
Adom, one of my dissertation students of whom I'm proudest, I read your chapters with great amazement as they came, and I said, oh my God, I know so little about this. Just to connect generations, David Apter was my teacher in political sociology at Yale, and I am really fascinated to hear these comments because David Apter was an American communist, I think, or communist sympathizer, and he went to Ghana with the greatest of hopes. So I got to look that up. So there are here profound interconnections. I guess what I am struggling with, and it may be part of a conversation I've been having with Bernard this last year since his book on critique and praxis, is the meta question about worldly philosophy and where critical theory is doing. And then there's fantastic work on post-colonial history and theory that just is really opening up new worlds. You know, your phrase, Adom, that was inspired also by Hannah Arendt. I guess I'm not quite sure how they are connecting, and but there should also, in no case should there be an antagonism. We should try to just keep this conversation open. Worldly philosophers, I mean, the last time I heard that phrase, Robert Heilbronner has a book called Worldly Philosophers that begins with Adam Smith. I don't know if that's how you picked it up, you know, Bernard, but the term to me is a bit incongruous. Is it a critique of philosophy? Is it a critique of critical theory? What is it? I think it is a little bit a frustration about the fact that maybe the third or fourth generation of critical theory, in the sense now, the narrow Frankfurt School, has become much more academic. And that's not the topic of the conversation here. And I think that within my generation of critical theorists, we have our own tensions. Nancy Fraser and I come out of the women's movement, and that's to whom we still have an obligation, as you know, Alyssa was pointing out. I also come from an now authoritarian third world country, Turkey. I dip in and out of Turkish politics, and sometimes I write about it, sometimes I fall silent. But what I want to say here is that even within the fourth generation of critical theorists, the relationship to the world, the relationship to praxis, in one way or another, political commitment has not disappeared. And so in that sense, I don't know what, you know, the term worldly philosopher really means and why there should be a juxtaposition between critical theory and worldly philosophy. I think we are all living in the aftermath of the disappearance of the privileged revolutionary subject. There is no privileged revolutionary subject in the West or in Africa or anymore. There are emancipatory movements with partial and specific claims. And these movements are not avant-gardist, and thank God for that. But sometimes they can mobilize and they can come together. And this is the lesson that we have to also live with, the critique of the avant-garde, fragmentation, independent, you know, movements, but just a different landscape, which has to be part of our, you know, part of the diagnostic picture. So that's a little bit my concern about some of the directions that the conversation is going, but I find it incredibly important. And I really am very excited about bringing in, opening up, you know, the terms of this conversation. And so, yeah, thank you again.
Okay. Thank you, Seyla. I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I see that Sudipta Kaviraj has his hand up as well, and so maybe maybe let me pass the mic to you, Sudipta, and then I will come back and maybe address some of these questions of this distinction. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Bharat, for organizing this discussion, and both Adom and Karuna for starting a wonderful discussion. I wanted to make a very brief remark about the connection between the more politically worldly philosophers and the concern of people who do political theory in our generation. Let me put it this way, that, worldliness can have two meanings. There is a kind of political worldliness, and there is the worldliness about knowledge, that is, knowing the world well. I think the connection comes from this, that, and Bharat, you were absolutely right when you made a distinction between the more political and much vaster, much more ambitious orientation of people like Gandhi and Fanon, and the much more limited cognitive orientation of people who do post-colonial thinking today. But I think there is a connection. The connection is that you cannot reconstruct something that you do not know very well. And I think one of the problems with the nationalist project has been that I think in most cases we feel that our ability to transform our society is limited by the restricted and inadequate knowledge that we have of our social structures. I'll give you a simple example. I was attracted to Marxism very early. And of course, I was inspired by reading Lukács and Gramsci, Althusser, etc. But ultimately, I found that the major problem for Indian Marxism or Indian emancipatory project was not to understand class, but to understand caste. And you cannot understand caste without going into the texts in the Indian literature, which is partly in Sanskrit, partly in Persian, and things like that. So I think that is why at least I felt that you cannot do the political part of the reconstruction if you do not get into the cognitive part of the analysis of what has to be reconstructed. So I see the connection this way, and I suspect that this is something which is not merely true of India. I suspect that this would be true of most of the non-European world. So that's my sort of defense of the shift. But both a recognition that there's no comparison between the ambition of their worldliness and the meagerness, in a certain sense, of our worldliness. But I think there is a connection between the two. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sudipta. Thank you so much. So I want to address some of this, but I also want to make sure that anyone else who wants in on the conversation, Brent, did you want to jump in on this? And okay, so I'll go first. I'll go quickly though, because fortunately the blog is open, and so I'll work on drafting some of this with text. But I agree entirely that there shouldn't be an antagonism, that this isn't a question of exclusion or privilege. So I agree entirely with that. This is, and I also agree entirely. So that's to Seyla, and to Sudipta. I agree entirely that it's impossible to engage in a form of revolutionary reconstruction without the critique and the analysis of the crisis analysis that is foundational, right? And that anyone and that Fanon and Gandhi did have that as a foundation, did have critique as a foundation. And I agree that, you know, it's not as if what we need is a focus only on praxis, but that there is a connection, that there needs to be a unification of crisis, critique, and praxis. But nevertheless, I find it productive at this moment in time to be thinking about the example of more, and when the term worldly philosophers actually just was in BJ's essay, but philosopher critical thinkers who are not addressing their critique to fellow only to fellow critical thinkers who are in some sense, it's almost the difference between, you know, the decision to publish an academic book versus the decision to publish a trade book, right? Almost. I mean, that's a simplified way of thinking about these questions of audience, but that is relevant, that seems relevant. And in a way, oftentimes the broader audience that someone like Fanon or Gandhi was addressing to creates a difference in the theoretical work somehow, and that's what I'm trying to get at. And so definitely this isn't a question of privileging, it's a question of trying to tease out somehow what it is about that project of actually revolutionizing in some way the social space that has effects on our own theorizing and on our own understanding and on our own forms of critique as well. So you know, we come back to the question, who would we read as revolutionary philosophers today in a third section of your essay on anti-colonialism and post-colonial theory? I think that's a really important question. I'd like to know who would that be, and the fact that, you know, maybe the fact that there's not an obvious clear category, although maybe there is reflective of something. In my spaces, I'd like to think of someone like Derricka Purnell, who just published Becoming Abolitionist last week, an extraordinary book. We'll have a session on that, as almost as a worldly philosopher, more so than an academic critical theorist. And so I'm interested in what is it that does to the work. How does it change the thinking? How does it change the texture? What is different about, for instance, and I'm speaking about that because I'm more familiar with that, with the space of abolition democracy, and that seems to be a kind of intervention that seeks an ambition, a transformative, almost a revolutionary transformation of society in a way that doesn't talk to us. I mean, that isn't limited to being in the either in the critical theory context or in the academic context, and so that again, it's not a question of privileging it. And I myself, published most of my work in academic presses, right? But it's to try and figure out what it does and how come today, for instance, do we have a fourth category that leaps to mind? If not, is it a question of the chastened nature, the historically chastened nature of the present? The way in which ambitious projects in the 20th century didn't always succeed, and as a result of that, that there is a more chastened nature to critique and praxis, right? I think those are questions that to me right now, particularly at this moment, are of incredible salience. I don't want to put you on the spot, Adom. Do we have, who fits in the fourth category?
I don't know if I have one. I mean, I think, you know, part of the question of audience, it seems to me, is not just whether we as academics or theorists, et cetera, speak to a wider audience or not, but whether we see ourselves in political community. So the audience, I mean, part of the thing about the audience that James and Padmore and others are writing is that it's not just that they're writing trade press books as we might write, right? But that they understand themselves to be part of a political community that maybe it's not static, of course, that's transformed and transforming over the peer process. And they're hoping to transform it as they're writing. Also, they're hoping to shape and expand and build that audience. But I guess I think the bigger question, the first question would be not where are the worldly philosophers, but where are those set of political communities from which a worldly philosopher might emerge. And I think you put your finger on one possible site, which is the kind of emergence of the movement for our Black lives, right? And the abolitionist project as one place. And, I think that has generated a really interesting resurgence of memoir, autobiography as a form of kind of elaborating the praxis that various activists were engaged in. I'm thinking of Shirlene Carruthers' book, for instance, who has led BYP 100, Mariam Kaba's work, right? So I think there is this prior question about maybe what are the political projects that would generate this form of theorizing.
Right, thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Could I say one thing about
Sudipta's
question or comment, which is, I think that his point about having to understand the colonial and post-colonial societies also really, I think, sharpens the distinction between two forms of the critique of Eurocentrism. So the critique of Eurocentrism that Fanon and Gandhi are engaged in is one that's trying to, it's a critique of illusions, maybe as a way of, that you might put it, Bernard, but a way of saying, this set of our own the fact that we're so enamored by the West, right, prevents us from understanding our societies. And it's by kind of ridding ourselves of that form of attraction or that we might better understand our societies. And this isn't, again, I think, as we try to show in the article, it's not one that's a rejection of Western thought as such or something like that, but it has that quality. And I think that process, collective process, again, of trying to undo a set of, a certain kind of enamorment with the West is very different from the way that a critique of Eurocentrism has been taken up in political theory.
Thank you, Adom. Brent Edwards, you're going to have the last say. Well, yeah.
Can I take it in a different direction?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Wait, where are the cameras? Where do you want me to sit? I can sit next to you. I was watching over in my office. I didn't know you were actually in town. We're about to do something online.
Yes.
In a few weeks. I thought I have to go over and actually say hello in person. But I did have a comment, which will take it in a different direction.
Yeah.
And it's a James-related comment, and I wanted to ask us to return and think about the relationship between the Black Jacobins and the Nkrumah book.
Mm-hmm.
Because in relation to James's stance as an intellectual and the book as an object, the book as a mechanism of making a certain kind of political intervention. Do I have to hold it up? At first glance, it looks like we have there an easy, because James straddles the periods, an easy comparison between the anti-colonial and the post-colonial, between the interwar and the moment of decolonization. But it's complicated because, as David Scott points out, Black Jacobins itself straddles the two periods because it's written in first published in 1938 and then revised in 1963, as David talks about. And I think I've always thought Nkrumah, you have to, because it's published in the 70s, but it's really a book about the 60s and the ouster of Nkrumah in the 60s. You have to read it in conjunction with the revised Black Jacobins and Beyond a Boundary. Caliban has discovered regions that Caesar never knew. James's great book about cricket, which is not at all just a book about cricket. Those three books from the early 60s, Revision of Black Jacobins, Beyond a Boundary, and Nkrumah, really have to be thought together. And I think on the one hand, there's a question of audience that gets, when you think it through the book as an intervention, gets framed in a different way than the way you were just talking about it. I also don't think that it falls into David Scott's seductive argument about Black Jacobins, that we have a shift from a framing of the historicization of revolution as romance in 1938 to the frame of tragedy in the revision of Black Jacobins in 1963. If you think about it in terms of audience, it becomes really stark, right? Because Black Jacobins is overtly, at the end of the introduction, he's writing this book for an African audience. He thinks that the revolution is around the corner. He thinks anti-colonial revolution is about to happen, not World War II. Anti-colonial revolution is about to happen, and what we need as a catalyst is a usable past, is a diasporic story of the Haitian Revolution, a successful revolution, to prod the African masses towards revolutionary praxis. The Nkrumah book, the audience is completely different. It's very carefully framed, but he says, I was just looking at the introduction to that book, this book was concluded at a time when I feared for the future of Africa under African auspices. So they're both books about representative Black male intellectuals and stories of failure or fatal flaws, with Toussaint as the leader of the Haitian Revolution on the one hand and Nkrumah in Ghana on the other. But in directing Nkrumah, the Nkrumah book, to a diasporic audience at a different time, but a different diasporic audience as well. But it's also an African audience. He's writing it for Ghana, in a sense. Audience is handled, is framed, is aimed at in a completely different way. And the posture, the tone, the political tone, and what the political tone implies about the horizon of revolution is completely different if we move from one book to the other. I also would say very quickly, I'll stop after this, the other thing that always strikes me when I teach it, because I teach it in a class, I teach about Black radicalism and archives, because the C.L.R. James papers are here. I teach it with James's actual letters to Nkrumah in this period. The other thing I'd say about it is if Black Jacobins is a densely, richly archival historiography, you know, you think of James in the Bibliothèque Nationale digging into the archives of the Haitian Revolution. The Nkrumah book is an archive, and that's its intervention. It is itself a compendium, like the whole last third of the book is a compendium of letters and articles and speeches. James, that stuff is not available anywhere else. James is collecting it and putting it into circulation through the vehicle of the book. So the intervention is an archival intervention, but in a completely different way from the Black Jacobins. But I hope I'm making sense. What I'm trying to say is that thinking about the books as intervention at these two moments actually takes us back to this question of, I don't think I want to get pulled into what is a worldly philosopher, but it gives you a very different approach to the questions that you've just been talking through. well, I guess we're going to have to stop, but that could be a whole other conversation.
Right, right. And Adom, you're going to have the last word. But it's right. I mean, in other words, for everyone here, right? The Nkrumah book, I mean, it's a temporally, it's so many different time zones, right? There's the bulk of it, which is the 1958. It was written in 1958, you know, at a time of optimism, and then there's the 1960s part, right, with even the all falling apart, but then the introduction, that's 1977, you know. So I mean, it has all these like layers to it. Go ahead, Adom.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. I think this is really, really helpful, and just a way of kind of helping us further interrogate these two moments as very different ones. You know, I guess I don't have much to say. I think I'll just say both in that the introduction ends up with the part you read ends with this pointing to Tanzania, right? In the late 60s, the Arusha Declaration as one other possibility. And then there's a later a mention of Chiseza as a Malawian nationalist who wrote a pamphlet about economic development as another set of possibilities. And I think what James is trying to suggest in those two moments is not just that the revolution may be revived or something like that, but both of them, I think, for him, suggest this possibility of rethinking what the form of the African state is. You know, he says also in the introduction, I told the Ghanaian audiences I spoke to in 1960 that there may be a kind of there is, of course, the question of Africa's international relations, but this is above all and primarily a problem of the domestic African state. And these two moments, Tanzania and Malawi, suggest perhaps, he thinks, different orientations to the question of the African state. So I'll end there, and thank you for the really rich comment.
All right. Well, we are out of time. Unfortunately, this has been such a rich discussion. Thank you all. Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Seyla. Thank you, Sudipta. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Karuna. Thank you, Adom, for this brilliant conversation. Thank you, Che, for this brilliant conversation. We meet next on, I believe it's October 27th, if I'm not mistaken, October 27th. It's going to be at noon. It's going to be noon to 2, and we're going to be on Zoom, okay? Because it's going to be Etienne Balibar, who was supposed to be here physically for a few weeks, joining us at Columbia, but unfortunately, because of the COVID nightmares, will not be here physically. So it's going to be 6 o'clock for him in Paris, but it'll be noon for us. So we'll be going from noon to 2, and we'll be looking at Gramsci, we'll be looking at Sartre, and we're looking at the debate over the engaged philosopher. Maybe I'll be changing the words, but I'll stick with worldly philosopher for now, but we'll be looking at the engaged philosopher in a couple of weeks. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you all.